This is my cat Mia. I have 3 cats, so maybe we'll get to meet some of the other ones. She just showed up here. We're going to dive into loops. We've already talked about for loops, but we're going to look at other ways of looping and iterating. We're also going to talk more about software development, testing, and debugging, and some of the essential parts of making code that works. And we're going to start to look at the quality of the code we write. That is, what makes code good, what makes it easy to understand and easy to maintain and easy to write. We're going to do all of this by starting with a new problem, which is to create a list of random numbers. Well, that sounds simple enough because it turns out, in fact, Python has a utility function that will generate random numbers for us, so that's not the hard part. But what I really want to do is not just make a list of any random numbers, but a list of random numbers with certain properties. And the key property is I want them to be unique. That is, I don't want any of the numbers to repeat themselves. So we're going to have to think about how to solve that problem. And then we'll also make sure our random numbers are within a certain range. So we'll pick a range, say maximum size of maximum value of 10, and we will pick random numbers between 1 and 10. So the specific problem I want to solve is to generate a list of unique random numbers that are integers between the value 1 and some specified maximum value. So when you're faced with a computer problem like that, we have to think about how we're going to solve it. Let's start by drawing out a sketch of what this might look like. Sometimes drawing is the best way to try and conceptualize what a problem is, then you can start breaking it down, and that makes it more possible to think about how you're going to actually dive into coding it. If you just try and start coding it without really knowing what is going on, then that doesn't usually work too well. It's like writing a paper before you've figured out what it is that you want to say. First, you need to think about what it is you're trying to do and how you're going to do it, and then we need to start coding.
So how are we going to address this problem? Let's start by assuming that we have some simple function that is going to be able to generate random numbers for us of the right size, say between 1 and a specified maximum number. And we know about lists, so let's just draw a growing list. And what we want to do is generate a random number and put it in each one of these boxes. So we generate a random number, add it to the list. Generate a random number and add it to the list. Generate a random number and add it to the list. We can do this, and if we do it, it will work fine. Maybe we'll get some random numbers like this, and that's pretty good. But when we generate a random number, each one is independent of all of the others, and so we might generate a random number that's already been in the list before, and that would be a bug. So let's start by writing this program because this is simple. And then we're going to spend a little while talking about bugs, how to find them, how to fix them, and how to make sure that we don't run into them in the first place.
So let's see what that code would look like to generate a list of non-unique random numbers. We'll define a new method called non-unique random rands. Say, make it a little bit shorter. Ask for the number. We'll take a parameter which is the number of random numbers to generate and the maximum value that each random number should have. Then what we'll do is we will initialize a list called rands. Rands equals an empty list, and then we'll loop with a for loop num times, and for each time we'll generate a random number and add it to the list, just like we anticipated in that diagram. So we're going to loop for I in, we need to have a list that is num items long. You may remember that there is a function called range which takes an integer and will generate a list with the numbers 1 to num, but that is essentially a list that's num items long, so we can iterate over that list, and that will result in us having a loop that goes the right number of times. So for each of those things, we want to generate a random number. Now, how do we generate a random number? Well, let's just ignore that for a second. I'll just put in a fixed value 3 so we can get the rest of this working. Now, we can take that value 3 and add it to our list in the way we've seen before with the append method. And when we're done, we write indent back to the left because our for loop, we're done iterating on our for loop, and we return the list that we made. Okay, so now we can try this out by calling non-unique rands. Let's say we want 5 random numbers, and let's say we want them in the range from 1 to 5. Of course, right now that max isn't being used yet, but that's okay. We'll just put that in there for now. And let's run this. We haven't configured this project yet, so we'll say run ... It will say run test because that's the name of the file I created. Now, the program ran. It didn't actually do anything because we forgot to print that list, so we'll just modify our code a little bit by putting a print statement at the beginning of this. So this will print the result of calling non-unique rands. Now we can run this, and sure enough, we get a list of 5 3s. They're not random numbers because we just hard-coded in the value 3. Now, how do we get a random number? Well, it turns out there is a little library called random, and in random is a method called randint, which takes 2 parameters, which is the smallest value and the largest value, in this case it'll be max. In order for this to work, we have to tell Python that we want to use the random library, and we do that with the import statement, and we just say that we're going to import the random library, and now we can use all of the methods inside of the random library. Random is built into Python, so we don't have to do anything more, but we have to tell Python that we want to use it. And now when we run it, it worked. Sure enough, we got 5 random numbers in a list between 1 and 5, and not too surprising, they weren't random. Some of them were duplicated. In this case, we got 3 4s. And in fact, every time I rerun this, I'll get different random numbers, and just about every single time, there will be some numbers that are duplicated because of the way that this works. In this case, we know what the problem is. In fact, we wrote the code with this problem in mind. But programming is tricky, and a lot of times you write programs and you don't know that there's a problem. You accidentally have a problem, and it's not always so obvious what the problem is or that there even is a problem. So software developers have to consider how they're going to test their code as a fundamental part of developing their code. And in fact, it's so fundamental that serious software developers actually write the tests for their code before they write their code. That is, they know what the output of their program is supposed to be, so they write tests to ensure that the output is correct. Right? They know what they're trying to do, so sometimes the tests are relatively easy to write. And then they start writing the program, and they run their tests as they're writing their program, and they find out whether their program is meeting the test requirements or not. This is really just a fundamental way that programmers think about coding. We're going to be doing a lot of this. And so we're just going to get started and do that right now. Before we try and fix this program, let's try and write some tests that will make sure that we write the right kind of unique random number list. It will fail with our current implementation, but as we develop a better solution, our tests hopefully will show that our better solution is correct. So what would make a solution correct? Well, what we're doing is generating a random list of numbers. So they're supposed to have a certain value, right? They're supposed to be between 1 and maximum. So one requirement is that each number in the list should be greater or equal to 1 and less or equal to maximum. So having the right kind of values is one requirement. Another requirement is that there aren't too many of them. Right? If we said we want a list of 5 numbers, well, we should have exactly 5 numbers, not 3 and not 7. So that's a second requirement, having the right number. And the third requirement is that what we want the numbers to be unique. right? We want each number in the list to be different than all of the other numbers. So we want to write a test that checks for these three different requirements all together. We're going to go ahead and see if we can write that test.